Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and in case it isn't obvious, today we're going to be talking about the Sega Genesis or Sega Mega Drive pretty extensively. Specifically, we're going to be talking about this. This is the Mega SD by Terraonion. Full disclosure before we get started here, this was sent to me for free for the purposes of review by Stone Age Gamer. So if you like it or any other stuff that Stone Age Gamer has, please check the link in the description and you can go support them and support Terraonion because what they made here is really cool. Now Stone Age Gamer was also cool enough to throw in this. This is just like a case that I can put the cartridge into after I take it out of the box. This is their like special bundle edition and includes that. It also includes an 8 GB micro SD card. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Now we're gonna open it up here in a second. I've already used it, so we're doing the full review here and now. I just repackaged it so you guys could kind of see the unboxing, as it were. I unboxed this originally in the previous episode of Playload, in case you care. But okay, so what is this thing? What's going on? What's happening? Basically, the long and the short of it is, this is a flash card for the Sega Genesis. And before you leave, because I know that a whole bunch of those exist, this one is kind of special. The concept is not new. The idea is you take this cartridge and you have an SD card and you load it up with games. In this case, you could load it with Sega Genesis or Mega Drive games. You can load it with 32X games. There's a bit of an asterisk with that one. Or Master System games. Also an asterisk with that one. And you can play them all on original hardware and have every game ever made, basically, is the idea. But this thing was special because it also added new support. In addition to features like having the memory backup system, I believe there's some save states, although I never quite got that one to work. There's another great thing about this, which is that it allows you to play Sega CD games, or Mega CD games, off of a cartridge. Which is pretty cool. So if you're interested, stick around and we'll talk about it. Now, that's what makes this thing the Mega SD, and that's what makes it like this new awesome idea. Although I believe there are future versions of this type of thing that are still coming. Terraonion was first out of the gate with that particular idea, and it's not the first time they've done this. They also made like the Neo SD, which I did a review on a while back. Terraonion makes some really cool stuff. There's an updated version of the Neo SD that also plays Neo Geo CD games, although as I understand it, that's still kind of in its infancy. But this one, on the other hand, was very refined. It played every like Sega CD game I threw at it, with certain exceptions, which we'll get into in a bit. But how does that work? You're probably wondering, like, don't you need the Sega CD hardware in order to be able to do that? Do I still need a Sega CD? Well, the interesting thing is, no. In fact, it's bad to have one in this situation. So the way it works is, this is not emulation as we traditionally think of it. Emulation, and this is from a layman's understanding of the situation, when you think of an emulator, that's basically a piece of software replicating or attempting to be a piece of hardware on a different piece of hardware. The difference here is this is hardware pretending to be other hardware. This is an FPGA of the Sega CD. So from the Genesis perspective, it's like, all right, that's the Sega CD. I don't know the difference. It just sees hardware. Interestingly, you might be wondering, well, do I have to plug it in the side or anything like that? No. You just stick the cartridge in the cartridge slot. When it comes to the Genesis, its boot priority was the cartridge slot, and if it didn't see anything there, it would check the side port, the expansion bay, and if it didn't see anything there, then it wouldn't do anything. But yeah, that's how the Sega CD would work. If it didn't detect a cartridge game, it would just check for the Sega CD or anything there, and boom, that's what you get. So in the case of this, it just detects the cartridge port, detects and thinks that that's the Sega CD, and goes, okay, Sega CD. It doesn't know any different. Now, when you turn it on, you're introduced to a menu system. This menu system does require some tinkering. And that was really the only criticism, I guess, I have of this thing, is just like kind of the setup that was required, but that's to be expected with any sort of flash card, so it's not really a knock against it. But what you're supposed to do is, when you first turn it on, it'll come with a set of at least the Stone Age Gamer version came with a set of games that were specifically unlicensed, free-to-use games. So you have that just to try it out. But when you turn it on, it'll also create 3 additional subfolders for things like save states and cheat codes and that sort of stuff. But yeah, so it'll have that. But after that, you'll want to basically make your own set of folders based on your own method of organization. So I created 4 specifically for games. One would be Sega Genesis games, one would be 32X games, one would be Sega Master System games, and then one would be Sega CD games, which seems simple enough. However, each one of those has a little bit of a quirk to it. And so I recommend doing some organization within those. 32X, not that big of a deal. There's not enough games to really matter. So there's only like 44 games ever made for it or whatever. So you just put them all in that one folder and you're fine. And we'll get back to 32X later. The Master System, while we in North America typically think of it as this complete flop, it actually had a ton of games in Europe and still continues to this day in South America, specifically Brazil. So it's not exactly a dead console, and it does have a pretty big library of stuff. So that one's also good to break up into multiple subfolder systems. Personally, I recommend you have a Master System folder and then go in and be like, 0 to M and then M to Z or N to Z, so that you can just kind of break it up. And the reason you want to break it up, other than just, not boggling your mind, is it really does help with like the loading times of this thing, because every time you create a folder directory, it has to go into that folder and kind of scan everything in there. The less stuff that's in there, the less time it's going to take to load. So if you break things up into the alphabet or whatever, it'll be quicker to get to your game. And the Genesis, the same thing. Now, the Genesis Mega Drive had a ton of games, obviously, so that one's very good. I actually split that up into individual letters. So you start with 0 for numbered games, but then after that, just A through Z. That was me. You could do it however you like. It doesn't really care how you do it. I'm just giving you some suggestions. The one that mattered, though, was Sega CD. Sega CD was the only one that operated differently. I created a folder called Sega CD, and then I just threw a whole bunch of games in there. But it wouldn't work. I couldn't go into the folder and choose my game. It would literally just pick the first game every single time. It treats the folder as if it is the game. So the only solution to this that I could find was create a Sega CD folder and go inside that, and then create a subset of folders. However you feel like doing it, but maybe you can do 0 through M and then N through Z, and then you have to break those up even further. So every single game at the end of the day needs to have its own folder. So if you want to play Sonic CD, you should make a folder called Sonic CD and then just put Sonic CD in that folder. Because then as far as the system, or as far as the cartridge knows, you're just going through a subset of folders. But once you get to the folder labeled Sonic CD, even though it's the game's inside that folder and you haven't gone in the folder, when you press on the folder, it just starts the game. I don't know. I don't know why it's different for that one as opposed to all the others, but that was what I figured out. So I recommend doing that. The other thing you'll have to do, particularly if you Sega CD stuff, is you'll have to create a folder called BIOS. And with that folder, you will have to go out of your way to get the Sega CD BIOS files, which is not necessarily the most legal thing to do. It's not challenging, and I can tell you Sega likely wouldn't care, but technically, yes, it's gray area stuff, so keep that in mind. But you do require those files, and they have to be put in the BIOS folder. So what I recommend is you kind of do all that legwork first, turn this thing on, and then you load it up and you tinker with some of the settings. There's a lot of settings in this thing, and you can customize it to a million different ways. Some of the cool ones include things like FM sound enabling for Master System games. For those who don't know, in Japan, the Sega Master System had this extra sound adapter called the FM sound card. I believe it was built into their version of the Master System, whereas it was not built into ours. So if you had that, you'd get far better sound quality out of the console. And even weirder, all the games that supported FM sound over there supported it over here. We just didn't have the card, so they didn't bother to use it. But with this thing, it's enabled, so you can actually enjoy the FM sound. Obviously, as I mentioned before, this thing acts as a memory card for the Sega CD. I believe it's, like I said, it supports save states and all that sort of stuff, and it has cheat code functionality, etc. You can use those. It also has region-free capabilities, so you can play games from any and all regions, including the Sega CD. However, that can require some tweaking. There's an option to automatically try to figure that out for you every time. I found that sometimes that setting worked, and sometimes it created problems where it didn't before. So on a case-by-case basis, you might have to tinker with that. You just have to get it to where you like it, I guess. And then you also have to go in and actually manually select the BIOS files that you prefer to use. This is one part just because I think they require you to do it, but also another part because you can customize. There are various versions of the Sega CD BIOS, not only regionally, but also just in terms of cool. Like you could have the JVC XI BIOS if you really wanted to. Doesn't really matter. It just at the end of the day has to be able to play Sega CD games. So that's a lot of the oddities about it as far as usage. But the only other thing I could really think of when it comes to setting it up or doing any sort of pre-planning is keep in mind the Stone Age Gamer version of this that I got, this particular bundle, comes with an 8GB micro SD card, which doesn't sound very big because it's not. However, it's worth noting that the entire Sega Genesis, Sega Master System, and Sega CD library combined is like a gigabyte. It's really not that big. So you can get every game ever made easily on a micro SD card of 8 gigs. The problem is the Sega CD games. While they're not that big either, they are substantially bigger than the other ones. In fact, with just the right 2 games, if you wanted to on the Sega CD, they could equate more data than the entirety of those 3 game libraries combined. So 8 gigabytes is most certainly not going to get the entire Sega CD library onto a single card. However, I didn't have like a spare. It recommends, or it says it supports up to 400 gigabyte cards. I don't know if it's, well, it shows a picture of a 400 gigabyte card. I don't know if that means that's its cap. I would have tried a 512, but I didn't have one sitting around. I had an extra 128 gigabyte card and an extra 32 gigabyte card. I decided to go with the 32 gig card because 128 gigs is a lot for the Sega CD, and I simply don't have a lot of games to go with it. However, 32 gigabytes wasn't quite enough. But it was enough to at least get the ones I would want to play onto it, which is totally fine, and for testing purposes. However, I tried to do the math on this as best I could because it's all estimates. It seems from calculation that there's around 200 Sega CD games, from what I could tell, a little over 200 worldwide. Not nearly as big as I actually thought it would be. Roughly, I would guess that plus the other 3 console libraries could easily fit onto a 256 gigabyte card. So I don't know why you would ever need a 400 gigabyte card, but you could probably fit all that onto a 256. You might be able to fit it all to a 128 gigabyte card. Maybe. But if you were, you'd be pushing it. I legitimately am not sure about that. I, again, don't have an entire library to test, so I can't say. But 256, I can't imagine you would ever need to go bigger than that. But the point is it does support at least 400 if you really want to do that. Now, so that was all relatively easy to use. When it comes to load times and things, honestly, I didn't notice it being any different than other flash cards. You know, with Genesis Master System 32X, it just kind of, once you load on the game, it kind of gives you a little bit of information about the game as far as like region coding and all that stuff, and then it just boots into the game, and then there it's completely normal. Again, these are not emulators. This thing is, as far as the Genesis knows, is a legitimate cartridge. It doesn't know any different. The Sega CD is the only one doing something special, and in that case, the Genesis just thinks of it as the Sega CD coming through the cartridge slot. That's all it thinks. So the only thing really unique about it, as far as operation, is the system software they put onto the cartridge specifically that allows you to load the games, which is got some additional features coming up, including preview scans and things like that that will be in future firmware updates. But as for the version I'm sitting on right now, everything worked pretty smooth once I got past that initial configuration, which, as you can tell by the way I'm talking about it, did take kind of a while to get kind of the best setup going, but hopefully that saves you some time. Now, you see that I have a ton of stuff out here. Let's talk about some of that after we take a look at the cartridge itself. Now, because we've been doing that forever and haven't even shown the thing. So inside, once you get past all that, nice box, you get a couple of things. First, the Stone Age Gamer included a couple of like card. Well, one's a card and one's a magnet, so thank you very much to Stone Age Gamer for doing that. Again, check them out, link in the description. They also include this little manual that has a bunch of information on the use of this thing, recommended settings, all sorts of just stuff you could peruse if you really wanted to, you know, figure out any of the questions you might have about it. But then in the end, they also have this support chart. Now, this thing's actually fascinating to me because it basically shows a whole ton of different Genesis combinations, and as you can see, there were quite a few. And it says like what works with what and what you need to do to make some of them work, etc. We'll go over that in a second. And then the cartridge itself, which I put right back into its bubble wrap. There you go. Take it out there. The cartridge shape might look familiar to you. We'll get to that in just a moment. But on the side is where you have the SD card slot. Like I said, I took out the original 8 gigabyte that I got and replaced it with a 32 gig. It also has this button on the side. This is how you know this thing was definitely designed in Europe. I believe Terraonion's based in Spain. You can tell because they cared enough to include this button. That's a pause button for the Sega Master System. Now, in North America, I don't imagine if anybody in the US was designing this thing that anybody would have cared to include this because the Master System was such a flop here, but in Europe it was a big deal. So the Genesis did not have a way to pause Sega Master System games. In fact, if you got those add-ons for the Master System for the Genesis, they would include the pause button on the add-on. So the only thing they could do to solve that was to give you a physical pause button on the cartridge if you want to pause a Sega Master System game. So they did do that, which is cool. Now, like I said, cartridge shape might be familiar. Looks exactly like the Virtual Racing cartridge, doesn't it? Because I think they just used essentially the exact same mold, or they just cloned it. Basically, very cool design, actually. I think it's making good use out of this infamous Genesis game. For those who are not aware of the story of the Virtual Racing cartridge, there was a time in the mid-90s when the Genesis was winding down where Sega was like, we want to squeeze a little bit more out of the Genesis, and they thought they could start pushing the hardware more. But in order to do that, they would have to put these special chips, in these what's called an SVP chip, inside of the games, and that would give them additional 3D capabilities normal Genesis games wouldn't have. However, this proved to be too cost prohibitive, and they just couldn't really do that. It would have made the games too expensive. So that's kind of where the 32X was born from. They thought, we'll sell them the hardware once, and then just make these new 32X games that are cheaper to produce as a result if they bought the 32X. So the only game that ever used that technology was Virtual Racing, therefore it's a unique game. Funny enough, because of its unique tech, the Virtual Racing cartridge does not work on the 32X and usually does not work on flash cards. However, it does work with the Mega SD, so that makes the Mega SD unique in yet another way. And like I said, I got this cool case for it that I'll be putting it in there. Now, let's talk about the cartridge usage and really what does it work on and what do you have to do, what's weird about it, why is there so many of these damn things. Yeah, Sega was a little nuts in the 90s. It's like they got this big hit on their hands and they didn't really know what to do with it. So, like I said, this thing plays basically four consoles. Master System, 32X, Genesis, Sega CD. However, when certain hardware is attached or not attached, it becomes restrictive. The 32X being the most annoying, probably. If you have this cartridge, like let's say this is actually right here. This is the Genesis I typically use. This combo, the Tower of Power, or as it was once known, the Machine. The Genesis Model 1 high-definition graphics model with the 32X with a Model 1 Sega CD that does work. Now, if I take this combination and I stick this cartridge into it, what's going to happen? Well, it'll boot up, but it's only going to allow me to play Genesis games and 32X games. It will not allow me to play Master System games, and it will not allow me to play Sega CD games. This is not a fault of the cartridge, it's just how the Genesis is. The truth is, you can prove this if you want to. If you take one of those Master System adapters like I was talking about and you plug it into a 32X, the Genesis will not be able to recognize it. The 32X cancels out the ability to play Master System games. And if you're wondering why it could play Master System games in the first place, Sega had the foresight to put all the Sega Master System hardware into the Genesis. They just didn't make the cartridge slot the same shape, so you couldn't natively plug into it. You had to get those adapters. But because the hardware is in there, a cartridge like this could access it, and therefore you can play Master System games. But the 32X prevents that. Now, again, because of the way the combination works, if you have the 32X in there, let's just say you're like, okay, I have the 32X and I have the Genesis, and now I have this cartridge. I can't play Master System games, whatever, I'm an American or a Canadian. I don't care. I want to play my Sega CD games. Can't. Because the 32X also prevents the Sega CD games from working. The only purpose the 32X has with this cartridge is if you want to play 32X games specifically. Because you cannot play 32X games without the 32X. So just keep that in mind. 32X's only function with this cartridge is just 32X games, as it prevents everything other than Genesis from working. Okay, now, the Sega CD is also interesting because it's ironic. If you're like, okay, I actually have a Sega CD, so I'll play my CD games, but I'll get this one for the expensive ones that I'll never own, like Snatcher or whatever. Cool, but you can't keep the Sega CD connected if that's the case. Like I said before, the way this thing works is its boot priority is this, and then it has a connects down over there. You can't keep it connected because it'll just get confused as to which is really the Sega CD. So you have to disconnect the Sega CD, ironically, to play Sega CD games on it. Just how it is. So if I were to take the 32X out and then say, okay, all right, we're just going to we're going to plop it in here now. This is our combination. Well, Master System games are now going to work, and Genesis games are still going to work, but 32X games will not, and Sega CD will not. So if I disconnect it like that, now Sega CD games will work, Master System will work, and Genesis will work, but 32X will not. There is no combination, I hate to say this, but it's true, there is no combination that you can just keep permanently rigged up that will allow you to play all four. At least not on original hardware. But Yeah, their guide goes into detail talking about what it does with some of these consoles and therefore, you know, what you should do. But they only tested it to a point, because as you can see, there's a lot of these things, and there's even versions of the Genesis I don't have, like the Sega Terra Drive and the Iowa Sega CD like Genesis boombox. Like there's a lot of weird stuff out there. But I decided to test the ones I had, but let's do a breakdown. Same rules I just said apply completely to this version. You have to take off the things, whatever, but it does work perfectly fine on a Model 2. And that goes the same for a Japanese Mega Drive or a European Mega Drive. Model 1 and 2 works just fine. If you want to test it with some of the other ones, they noted that the Genesis 3 and the Nomad both work, but they have some quirks. Obviously, neither was designed to have either attachment. So even if you have a 32X, you could stick it in these, but they wouldn't boot it. It's incapable. The Genesis 3 can be modified to do so, as can the the Sega Nomad, but most people never really bother. But it is possible. But because of that, it's not able to play 32X games even with a 32X, and it's not able to play Sega Master System games without modification. The key to both of those is with modification. That must be done. So with just the cartridge, if I were to be like, okay, that's what I just did. What do I get? You get Genesis without modification. You get Genesis, and you get Sega CDs, sort of. So Sega CD was odd as far as the way the games worked, because they were basically Sega Genesis games. They had additional benefits that were provided within the hardware of the Sega CD, things like dynamic scaling and all that, or rotating and scaling features, stuff like that. But the big draw to it was the CD quality audio you could get. So you'd get much better music and much better voiceover and all that sort of stuff. I'll let you listen to a quick audio example of a Sega CD game running off of this thing. Keep in mind that this is not an ODE like the GDMU, it's just using the cartridge ports, so they went for authentic load times, so it runs a little faster than off of an actual disc, but not by much. If you try to put this cartridge in there or in there, like and you play, say, Sonic CD, you will be able to get the game to start, you'll be able to play it, and you'll hear sound, but you'll only hear the Genesis sound. You'll only hear the stuff that's actually built within the game data, not the CD music. So it's an awkward Sonic CD experience because it's mostly silent. The Sega Cd X, which is the only one of these they actually make reference to, that's one of the combos, is unfortunately, and this applies to all of them, if you have a Sega CD attached to it like the CDX does, Sega CD stuff just doesn't work. It's out. It doesn't work. It'll play Genesis games. It'll play Master System games, and with the 32X, it'll play 32X games. But there's no scenario in which you stick this cartridge in here and it starts playing Sega CD games. Unless there's some way that Terraonion eventually figures out some sort of workaround, which at this point in time seems impossible. Unless that happens, no, you can't play. Ironically, you cannot play Sega CD games on this with the cartridge. Now that was the end of where their lists go, but I went ahead and tested the rest of them, and these were the results. The same basic thing applies. In all cases, you would need a 32X attached. 32X does work on the XI. It does work on the Wonder Mega, though you would need a Japanese 32X because the Wonder Mega only came out in Japan and is an extraordinarily uncommon console. The 32X does not, however, work on the Pioneer Laser Active. So, okay, there's your understanding of the 32X now. Sega Master System. This one's interesting to me. It works on the Sega Wonder Mega, which at first doesn't seem like it would be that surprising, except that the Wonder Mega was kind of retooled and resold and brought over here as the JVC Xi. Okay, why does that matter? I put this in here, just like this, and you get your Genesis games. Like I said, you could have 32X if you attach it. Definitely no Sega CD, but no Master System. It just wouldn't boot any of them. I don't know. Maybe JVC just didn't care to include that hardware. I honestly don't know, but I thought that was interesting. But yeah, with the Wonder Mega, you put that in there. Once again, further proof that the thing is region-free. It fits, too. They left a little hole in there for the Japanese consoles. Yeah, it'll play Master System games, play the Genesis games. But, yeah, you know, 32X, if you have it and you attach it, sure. Actually, I take that back. Now that I remember, the 32X is not compatible with the Wonder Mega because it does not have that proprietary port that the 32X used. Unless Sega released some other adapter or something that I'm completely unaware of, then never mind. You can't use the 32X on the Wonder Mega. The one that was truly bizarre to me, though, the Pioneer Laser Active. And if you're looking at that like, what is this thing? I did an entire video on this. This was a strange little moment in video game history. But it does contain a Sega CD and a Genesis, as well as its own proprietary Pioneer Laser Active console that more or less uses Sega CD tech to make its own thing. Doesn't matter. What can you do with it? Well, I put it in there. Not surprising. Doesn't play Sega CD games. Obviously doesn't play 32X games. Does play Genesis, but the thing that surprised me the most is it did play the Sega Master System games. How or why they thought to put the Sega Master System hardware in this when there was literally no way to get to it, I don't know, but kudos to them. That's really cool. So yeah, those are just some of my findings with all of this. Now, before we go here, there's one other little oddity with the Sega CD Genesis 32X combo that is worth discussing because they themselves bring it up. I've mentioned this in the past, but I don't know who ever cared to retain it. There are just six, Sega CD 32X combo games, as in games that used all three combined, the power therein, to make a single game. Now, one of those games was considered a rumor until just a few years ago. It was a Surgical Strike, which only got a wide release, I kid you not, just a couple of years ago. There's a long story behind that doesn't matter, but if you exclude that one, although there's no reason to anymore, there's 5 officially known releases in North America, plus one that really only came out in Brazil, which was Surgical Strike. Now, in order to play those, like I said, you have to have all 3 of these devices. So how does that work with this thing? Well, the answer is it doesn't. You cannot play those 6 games with this cartridge yet. What's weird to me is that they have decided to address this. They actually even reference it on here. There's a device coming out called the MSDEXP. Now, I don't know what that's short for, but from what I could tell just reading about it, it's basically, I find this so unbelievably ironic. Let's just pretend, we're going to do a little puppet show type of thing here. Let's pretend for a second you're the guy who's like, I got a Genesis, this is what I'm using. And I got the cartridge. All right, I want to play my Sega CD games on this. No problem, you can do it now. And you're like, but I also would love to play those 32X CD games. How do I do that? Well, yeah, you can't unless you get their add-on, which, funny enough, is going to more or less replicate, as far as I can tell, the 32X. Cool, but it's going to do it through the Sega CD port. So you have Sega CD now working through where the 32X was, and you'll have 32X running where the Sega CD was. There is nothing more historically appropriate than a Sega Genesis cartridge that came out in 2019 requiring an add-on. I just think, I'm not knocking them. I think that that's cool as hell. The fact that they would care enough to be like, we're going to make an entire extra piece of hardware, we're going to do the engineering, we're going to design it, we're going to release it, we're going to sell it, so that it can play 6 games that no one on this planet cares about playing, except for maybe Vampire Mike Sega CD Universe. He's got to be the only person. The reason those 6 games especially do not matter is that all 6 of them came out on the Sega CD normally. The only difference is that with the 32X, they had an enhanced color palette. That's it. And they were all FMV games, so they're just basically video. So the video looks cleaner when you had the combination. That's it. But I give massive props to Terraonion, who actually is going to bother. So in the end, what do I think about all this? Well, I think that this thing is fantastic. I think that once you get past that initial hurdle of just kind of what you have to do to set up the folder structures and all that sort of stuff, loading your games is easy. You just pop it in, with an SD card reader into your computer, transfer your files, etc. Usage, relatively simple, pretty intuitive. You just open it up, click on your games, and you're good to go. The only flaw, which is not their fault, is the hardware limitations. It's stuff that was in the Genesis originally that prevents it from being able to have the Sega CD attached while you're trying to access the Sega CD through the FPGA. That sort of stuff. This is fantasy. I am not the engineer, obviously, and I think that these guys are really smart, so they would have, if they could have done this, they would have. If there's any conceivable way to somehow fix this with a firmware update so you can have this whole combo work and all 4 consoles, if you want to call it 4 separate consoles, all work at the same time, hey, that would be amazing. But short of having, Aladdin's Genie, which, funny enough, Aladdin's best on the Genesis, short of having that, I don't know if there's any real solution to making that work. But that's not even really a criticism of the device because it's not its fault. I think they did more than what you could realistically imagine for what this is. So I highly recommend it. But if you're asking about which configuration I would recommend it with, if I'm honest, I would say what you're going to want is just a Model 1 Sega Genesis by itself, preferably the early high-definition graphics models because these had better sound. And then you play it in there. That way you have full access to Master System, Genesis, and Sega CD. And just keep this on the side. Keep the 32X nearby just in case you feel like playing, Blackthorn or Spider-Man Web of Fire or any of those other games that no one ever really played. Calibri's pretty decent, though. But unless there's any of those that you want to play, just have that nearby. Just on the side. And then you'll be good to go. So that's my recommendation. So if you like this thing, you find it interesting, or any other stuff that Stone Age Gamer has, please go ahead and check them out. The link's in the description. Thank you very much to Stone Age Gamer for sending this to me. Thank you to Terraonion for making such an amazing product. Again, I just think it's really cool. I just love that we live in an age where, this is the thing that I would have fantasized about as a kid, like a massive special cartridge that lets me play everything ever. I just think that's the coolest thing ever. So thank you to everybody who was involved in making it. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you could like, comment, subscribe, appreciate that. Please check out the social media stuff in the description. Hit me up on all those platforms. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.